All right, this is what all of you were. This is what all the pastors who are here were afraid of. All right, so this is what. The church father Tertullian. Okay, he was living and ministering at the end of the 2nd century, beginning of the 3rd. Was confronted with church leaders who saw great benefit in trying to harmonize Greek philosophical thought with the biblical teaching. Tertullian was suspicious of these efforts and is famous for asking this question: "What hath Athens to do with Jerusalem?" So there's a number of folks here, including a number of pastors who were invited by a friend to come here today and hear why Christians should care about Bitcoin. And so when I think about you guys, including Chuck, I believe is in that situation, I couldn't help thinking that Chuck is probably sitting there right now, just as skeptical as Tertullian, and thinking to himself, "What hath Bitcoin to do with Jerusalem?" All right. So this is what we're going to talk about. Why should Christians care about Bitcoin? This is kind of the hinge point of the conference. Up to this point, we've kind of tangentially mentioned Bitcoin a little bit. Tomorrow, we're going to go into a lot of detail into different ways that Bitcoin is being used, very much more moving to the, just like the active ways in which people are working in and around Bitcoin, and ways in which Bitcoin is being used all over the world by people who are in utter desperation, people who are gospel workers, who are in places where the government has sanctioned, has prevented U.S. dollars from going into those places. Bitcoin basically says, there's organizations that are basically saying, hey, there's no provision on the Great Commission, saying that as long as your government gives you permission, you can take the gospel to the nations. Bitcoin is just basically enabling those funds and those works to go forward. We're going to talk a lot about those things. But as we do this, again, this day has been a lot of laying foundation and having a lot of these kind of conversations. But basically, we're going to get into just kind of bridging these two worlds, moving from the theological to Bitcoin specifically. And again, I realize the high wire that I'm on. I've been a pastor. I've served. And again, I realize basically what many of you are probably afraid of, and I assure you we're not going to do that. So to start, I want to fully appreciate and basically talk about how preposterous and cringe this might seem at the outset. It's going to be incredibly easy to write off the possibility or the idea that any meaningful relationship between such seemingly disparate topics could exist. But as I mentioned this morning, things are rarely what they seem. The idea that magic internet money could one day, that was given away for free on the internet, could one day be worth I believe, I haven't checked in a while, $65,000 sounds insane for most, it sounded insane for at least a decade, probably outside of the people in this room. Many of you, probably that doesn't seem very crazy. And so the prospect of it doing far more than that also, it probably makes more sense to people in this room than people outside of it. But here's basically where we're going to go. So in his book, Desiring the Kingdom, philosopher James K.A. Smith observed that behind every pedagogy is a philosophical anthropology. Can I get an amen? All right, sweet. Yeah, so there's probably a lot of you who are like, can we bring back the farmer? He made a lot more sense. A lot of what he was saying was much more easy to understand. Let's unpack this a little bit. So behind every pedagogy is a philosophical anthropology. What on earth does that mean? Smith asserts that every pedagogy, which is a method and practice of teaching, is necessarily built upon a foundational understanding, a philosophy of what it means to be human. That's anthropology. So in other words, just as oranges are the contingent visible consequence of a tree and root system that began long before the fruit itself ever existed, Smith claims that educational systems work the same way. There are no incidental oranges and no incidental educational systems. They all flow consistently and necessarily from the seeds that bore them of an understanding of what it means to be human. Here's the danger. Everybody wants the fruit, but far less people are willing to do the work to produce a bountiful harvest, right? Everybody wants the fruit. We want the end benefits of the hard work that goes in. But the temptation is always to underappreciate whether it's philosophical work that goes into this, which is kind of what we've talked about today, or the theological work, to get specifically into what we're gonna look at here. So this phenomenon is not unique to education. In the same way, what I want to argue today is that behind every monetary network or behind every currency is a philosophical anthropology. So every type of money or currency is shaped around an understanding of what it means to be human. And so basically, it consistently flows out of an understanding of what it means to be human. So here's another phrase, or another famous quote that kind of illustrates this thought. So Winston Churchill, famous for being the Prime Minister of England during World War II, he has this famous phrase that says this: "We shape our buildings, and thereafter they shape us." I don't know how many poets we have among us. We have a talk tomorrow where it's going to be about George Herbert, who's another poet. I guarantee you were not expecting poetry at a Bitcoin conference. But basically, what Churchill was saying was that he's basically saying we build these buildings. The ideas of what they should look like and how they should be formed, it comes from somewhere. They're not just accidents. We have a lot of our buildings were formed or built based on Greek buildings or Roman buildings that existed thousands of years ago, and that's because of the law, things like the law tradition that we come from. We're signaling, we're demonstrating to the world things that we believe and where we came from by the types of buildings we build. And what I want to suggest is that this same thing exists with something like money. Money does not just drop out of the sky. It doesn't just accidentally happen. There are different types of money that tell different stories about the nature of people and about the nature of the world that they inhabit. So why is this the case? Okay, because amongst other things, Bitcoin and money more broadly, money is a tool, right? Money is a tool that's created to serve specific purposes. It's a means to an end. Money is a means to an end. So effective tool making requires a skillful combination of and knowing the desired end state that the tool will reach and knowledge of the tool's end user as well. This is the reality of what we're going to look at here, is that neither money nor governments were created to serve themselves. Is this again, probably before today, now as of today we've thought of this, but why do governments exist? Why does money exist? I've said this in various platforms. We live in a world today that's in definitional crisis, okay? We live in a world where we don't know what anything is because we've turned away from having some sort of objective standard by which to determine what is real and what isn't real. And so we have things, again, you've heard things talked today, we are there, and even without even making moral judgments about these things, which I think there is warrant to do, but just even as an descriptive, in a description of the world we live in, we have confusion over what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, what is marriage, what is government. All of these things, we're at a point where things that were very obvious to people who lived a few decades ago is now are real open questions for people. And so one of these questions, or one of these areas where we have a lack of understanding is over this question of money. What is money? So money was not created for its own benefit to serve itself. If you take one thing away from this talk, this is what I want you to think about. Every time you think about money from now on, I want you to think of it like this. Money is will fulfillment technology. Okay, money is will fulfillment technology. The question is not whether or not money enables a will to be done, but rather whose will it enables to be done. This is, again, stealing from a pastor named Doug Wilson. It's not whether, but which. Okay, so the question with money is whose will is going to be done. And so fiat currency, jump over there for a second, fiat currency basically is money that's able to be created out of thin air at the will of governments, basically endlessly, that enables governments and central banks to enact a vision of the world according to a formula whose structure might sound very familiar. Let our kingdom come, and let our will be done. Okay, so governments, what do? The governments and central banks, they print money, they create money out of thin air to go fund projects all over the world, in the case of the United States, all over the country. A lot of the educational system, a lot of the education that's put forth in our public schools is only able to be there. Who chooses the curriculum? Well, states. There's some federal things that are required. And so wherever, basically, you're able to subsidize. Money allows you to subsidize certain beliefs, subsidize certain worldviews of what the world looks like and how it ought to be, what a vision of the good life. This is what money allows us to do. So here's the danger in this. Here's the danger with money is if there's certain parameters under which you can create money that says, money made by people that says, let my kingdom come, let my will be done, that can be done at the expense of the place that most of you are probably familiar with that structure, right? What's the biblical version of that structure? Let my kingdom come. Let your kingdom come. Let your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Who says that? Jesus, right? So Jesus, okay, he prays and asks, he's like, basically, whose will do I want my life to be used to further their glory, to further their cause, to further what they're trying to do in the world? Jesus says, I want, when you pray, and this is how he lived his life as well, we want to advance God's vision of the world and God's vision of how God wants the world to work. And so the danger with something like fiat currency is that it basically pits itself against the way that God has designed the world to function, which is rather than a world that operates according to the way God has designed, it sets that aside and establishes its own desires and its own vision of the good life that in many ways is working actively antagonistically against God's design. Here's in a word, like what does this look like? I came to think about this way too much while I was a pastor of a small church in Montevideo, Uruguay, and basically half of my church members were Venezuelan immigrants who had their lives turned upside down by the fact that their government made a bunch of promises. In order to get elected, their government had said, hey, we're going to give you this if you vote for us. And so the people said, well, that sounds great. And so they voted them in. And then the government said, all right, we're going to give you what you asked for. And so we're going to print a bunch of money in order to do it. And so what I saw in Uruguay was that there were thousands of Venezuelan immigrants flooding into Uruguay because their lives had been destroyed by the fact that now their money was worthless. And so as I was thinking about these things and trying to understand, just why this was happening and what do you do about this and how should I think about this as a Christian, I was doing sermon prep one day. I was in the book of Galatians, and I got to chapter 6, and I read the Apostle Paul, and he says this. He says, for God is not mocked. For what a man sows, that will he also reap. And so again, a lot of the people in our church were new Christians, and so I was trying to, again, I always work to try to explain this in as simple a way as possible. And so I was like, okay, so the Apostle Paul is saying that God is so hardwired this principle of sowing and reaping into the fabric of the universe that to deny it is to mock God. It's so obvious that the entire world works according to sowing and reaping. And so I was like, okay, let's put this to the test, right? What does this look like? And so I started to think about the book of book of 2 Thessalonians. And in there, the Apostle Paul is talking to these Christians who were sitting there thinking to themselves, well, Jesus is going to come back very soon. And so many of them had stopped working. They just said, all right, hey, we're going to stop being productive. Jesus is going to come. What's the point of working? And so the Apostle Paul, rebuked them and basically says, no, if one isn't willing to work, then neither should he eat. And so I was like, okay, so the Apostle Paul is saying that if the point of work, or the point of food is to give you energy to work. And if you're not willing to let food serve the purpose, use it for the reasons that God gave it, then you shouldn't get it. Okay? Does that make sense? You shouldn't get it. So then if we do this for long enough, what's the consequence? What happens if you don't eat for long enough? You die. So that's a pretty fixed principle of sowing and reaping, all right? Actions have consequences. Then we could go down through a whole bunch of these different things. God has a design we talked about it. God has a design and in order to, marriage and sexuality. So you get married in God's economy, and then you can enjoy sex and childbearing. And those are the things, and we find out just even statistically, those things flourish the best within the designs of marriage. And so I started to look at the scriptures through this lens and try to find, what are some other examples of this? And I found them all over the place. And so I just became more and more convinced. I'm like, this principle of sowing and reaping is everywhere. And it culminated, and I was like, okay, where's it going to culminate? Where's this going to be the most compelling? I was like, man, it would be really neat if it had something to do with Jesus, because Christians are pretty compelled by when Jesus says things. And so I thought of just the nature of salvation itself. So within Islam, Allah He can forgive sins. And so this is one of the things you'll hear if you hear Islamic apologists. They'll say, Jesus didn't need to die on the cross. Like, Allah can just forgive sins. He can just declare your sins are forgiven. There doesn't need to be a sacrifice. And so with the God of the Bible, the scriptures say the soul that sins must die. There's a cost, and it has to be paid, whether by us or by somebody else. And so Jesus coming to the world to die for the sins of the world, sins of his people, Jesus comes, he dies. And so this is like the ultimate evidence of what a principle that you're going to learn about tomorrow called like proof of work. There's no free lunches in God's economy. And so what hit me that day, as I was at the same time thinking about doing sermon prep, and at the same time that year I'd been learning about Bitcoin, was basically that this is what fiat currency enables governments to do is functionally make themselves gods. They basically make themselves gods and basically set aside, what God has done, what God is trying to do in the world. And basically it's allowed them to prolong the distance that Jimmy talked about, prolong the distance between sowing and reaping. Okay? Like in a normal world, if you don't work, then you don't eat that day. But something like debt, something like, trillions of dollars worth of debt allows the normalization of this kind of normalization of debt, the normalization of deficit spending, the normalization of lots of kind of things that can actually result in the situation we find ourselves in today when elected politicians who are, seemingly smart people can say absolutely asinine and insane things like debt is just money we owe ourselves. Okay? These things you would have been laughed out of the room for much of human history if you were to say something like that. And it's not only laughed at by us, but it's also mocked by God. So whereas fiat currency, mocks God, makes a mockery of sowing and reaping, makes a mockery of the idea that actions have consequences, how does God respond? God turns around and mocks them. God laughs at them. And there are few things more terrifying. Just imagine, there will be few things more terrifying than hearing God laugh in certain contexts, okay? Like there is a type of laugh that God will do that will be the most haunting thing that some people ever hear. And so one of the things that I think about when I started to think about Bitcoin, and I was, again, thinking about all these things at the same time, I thought of Psalm 2. Okay? I thought of Psalm 2. And in Psalm 2, basically the psalmist is sitting there talking. He's basically saying that the nations of the earth, one of the things they do is they set themselves against the Lord and against his anointed. And they basically say, let us cast his bonds off from us. Basically, God is restraining us from doing the things that we want to do. So let's just cast these things off so that we can do what we want to do. And what's the next thing that the psalmist says? God laughs at them. He laughs at them about the prospect of humans being able to just completely get rid of him from the world that he made. And so one of the things that just in seeing, so we're in this place, there's, multinational corporations. There's, the U.S. government is powered by the dollar, and it's just this huge thing working all over the world. And in the shadow of one of its greatest moments of collapse in 2008, you have this little tiny open source internet, magic internet money, this little project that just some dude puts on the internet for anybody who wants to. If you have the slightest level of interest in this thing, you can participate and you can benefit and do all these things. And so now 15 years later, here we are. Bitcoin, I believe, is like one of the top 10 largest currencies on earth in terms of market cap. And so with every day that goes by, there's more and more people who are recognizing that these national currencies are losing their value, are preventing them from being able to save and provide for their families, including in ways that the scriptures talk about. Like a godly man provides an inheritance, not solely a monetary inheritance, but in part provides an inheritance for his children's children. People are increasingly waking up to the fact that this money that's supposed to do this is actually preying upon me. It's actually stealing my buying power over time. And so as that's going on, you have this little open source internet project, magic internet money, Bitcoin, that's just out there, and more people are voluntarily choosing it. I have a bone to pick with Nayib Bukele. okay, the president of El Salvador, because he ruined a perfectly good illustration. And as a former pastor, there's few things that are more precious to me than a good illustration, right? So up until El Salvador made Bitcoin legal tender, one of the things that I always used to say to people was, every single Bitcoin transaction that's ever taken place has been voluntary, okay? Until they made it legal tender and forced some of their businesses to accept it, every single Bitcoin transaction, people adopting it had been completely voluntary. And so this is one of these things where, why does this matter? Because one of the ways that this is, rather than by force, okay, one of the temptations for humans who are trying to make our own will done is to try to use force to get our own way. This could be true of parents. This could be true of governments or whatever it is. But this is in stark contrast to what we see embodied in the Scriptures and instructed in the Scriptures. God talks to sinful Israel. They're in exile. They're in all kinds of sin. And God, what does he say to them? He says, come, let us reason together. God doesn't just open up the trap door, everybody falls through, and then he starts over. He basically says, no, think about what you're doing. Think about the end. Think about the consequences of what you're doing. And so this is, God wants us to reason, and increasingly as these things grow more and more desperate, these banking entities and countries are growing increasingly more desperate and growing increasingly reliant on things like force, even when they completely oppose and go against just their own laws, their own constitutions. You have people who are desperate to try to retain this power. And as that's happening, Bitcoin continues just to win people. It just continues to win people because it's actually helping people in meaningful ways. People are voluntarily choosing to adopt it. Now, I am not sitting here saying that like Bitcoin is some like act of God. I do not believe that. I'm not trying to do that. What I do think is that there is a real sense in which, there's a real sense in which ideas are gifts from God. Okay? Ideas are gifts from God. God, our whole bodies are composed of information. They're literally composed of coded information. So law. And so God, basically, he gives resources. He gives children. He does all these things. He moves around resources in different ways. And one of the ways that God works is by giving ideas. And so I think about the idea of Bitcoin and what Bitcoin has become. It's not just this philosophical talk that sounds good on paper, but doesn't actually execute in the real world. What we're seeing is that Bitcoin has been able to stand up against nation states. China has banned Bitcoin 7 times. And the fact that they're doing that, some of you guys are doing math, and you're like, wait, that means that they had to unban it at least 6 times, right? There used to be this advertisement for, I believe it was Converse shoes. It was Dwayne Wade was a basketball player. He had a pair of shoes. And this poor, illiterate person was making up his marketing campaign. The marketing campaign said, fall down 7 times, get up 8. I was like, that doesn't work. So you have these things where this is what, basically God he's using this idea. This idea has teeth. It's actually able to stand up and withstand some of the most vicious censorship and other things in the world. It's being used by people to overcome outright malice and weakness of the existing financial system. And so this is part of why tomorrow we're going to thank God for Bitcoin. We're going to stop right there for now. I'm going to welcome, we have one more panel. We're going to welcome them up here. So give us 3 minutes as we get everybody up here.